And if they then transmit the message to the bank that you're doing some kind of illegal rental, that's a problem. Then there's also a problem at the time of resale, because if you have a lease that's not supposed to be there, or you're advertising a 5-plex when it's actually a 4-plex. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of the Real Estate Investors Club podcast. I'm here with a returning guest, Chauntelle, who is a coaching client and a management client of mine. Thanks for joining me today, Chauntelle.
Thank you for having me, Terrie.
Yay. And today we're going to talk about kind of an interesting issue of subletting and basement suites. So this is something that it's a big gray zone, and something where there's a lot of confusion that abounds. And just like Airbnb, there's like kind of a lot of little technicalities that you kind of need to know about in order to not get into trouble. And so, Chauntelle, we have a few questions. I'll leave it up to you whether you want to give us like a little bit of background as to, your journey as an investor and why this topic is of interest to you.
Okay. So my journey as an investor started roughly about 5 years ago. I pretty much bought my parents' place, and so here I am today. But I just had these burning questions about subletting and what exactly are the laws, what landlords can and cannot do, and how to basically avoid temptation.
Okay, so you're going to have to be a little bit more specific than that. What do you mean by avoid temptation?
Okay, for example, because subletting, right? Like if I know a friend or somebody who's looking for a place, especially right now, given the cost of everything that has gone up, the cost of living, and if landlords are trying to basically save money in a rent control environment like Quebec, and someone comes to a landlord and say, hey, can you sublet your basement for let's just say $1,000 or $1,500, it looks like a legal suite, but it turns out it could be an illegal suite. So that's what I mean by temptation, because you're like, okay, yeah, sure, it's a friend or a family member, hey, why not? Yeah. Not realizing you can get into a bunch of trouble if you did that.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take that apart a little bit, because I think that's the form in which a lot of landlords will have that question, but there's actually kind of a checklist of things you need to know about before we begin to answer it in a proper way. So the first thing is, when we're talking about a basement suite, usually the pattern of how it is you'll have a main floor, ground floor unit that has some form of furnished basement that could look like an intergenerational or an additional suite. So the things that you could look out for is, separate entrance, additional kitchen, additional hydro counter or electricity installation that would allow you to split the cost of the heating in some way. And you could also, if you want to know whether your suite is legal or not, the two places to look are your tax bill or your deed of sale. Okay. And so that's going to give you, especially the tax bill, is going to let you know at the city, at the municipality, how many units are currently registered. Okay. So I happen to know, I think that your property, which is a duplex/triplex, is registered at the city as a duplex.
Right.
Now you do have this, what that would be called technically an intergenerational, where you have a ground floor suite and then a basement suite that's connected by a staircase. There are separate entrances, and then usually separate plumbing installation, separate kitchen, separate bathroom, but often the heating system is connected. And in your case, the heating system is connected with the main floor unit. So there's no way to split the heating bill. Now, the heating bill is not the be all and end all, because in some cases, if the owner includes heating in both the rents of the ground floor and the basement unit, you can't say that a separate hydroelectricity account or heating account is what makes the determination of whether or not it's a legal or an illegal suite. But it's an indication. If you have a separate counter for the basement and for the main floor, that's a sign that someone at some point took it upon themselves to do things kind of in a kosher way, to say each tenant pays for their own heating and each one has its own electrical panel. If you see a common electrical panel for what looks like two units, that's a big red flag. That it can be legal, but it's unlikely, because usually building code stipulates that if there's a common counter, you need to have separate electrical panels for each unit, because each tenant needs to be able to shut off their own breakers in case of a problem. So like, imagine if you've rented two units and the panel is on the ground floor and the lights or some appliance goes on the fritz downstairs, you can't actually switch the breakers off without going into the other person's unit. So that's kind of an indication that there's a problem. Also, like, common water tanks is an indication that there's a problem. If you have two water tanks, one that's supplying the ground floor, one that's supplying the basement, that's another indication that somebody went the extra mile to actually separate things. But if it's one tank that's common to the two units, that should be an alarm bell. Now, let's say you have this like illegal suite that looks like it meets all the criteria to be transformed into something legal. Okay. And this then is quite technical, because each municipality will have its zoning regulations for what you need to have in order to meet those guidelines to have a separate suite. Now, I know, in Quebec, our construction code, what it stipulates, like, for example, one is something that has to do with the size of the windows. So there has to be 1 meter of clearance from the ground level to the ceiling of the basement unit. So for example, if you're thinking of these things where like you have these like tiny, 1 foot high window and it's sitting right at just above ground level, and then there's your ceiling. Even if it's an 8-foot ceiling, if the majority of the suite is less than 1 meter underground, the city is not going to give you a permit to create that as a separate unit. Okay. Mm-hmm. Then there's also laws about how the entrances and exits need to be done, because you have to be aware that like an independent unit has to have 2 exits. Right. And it needs to be like an independent exit. So for example, if you have a door that goes into the garage that does not have some kind of an entrance onto the front street or the side of the house or something, that's another indication that the city probably will not give you a permit for that kind of suite, because they assume that in case of danger, your emergency escape route can't be through a carbon monoxided garage. Okay, you have to have like a separate entrance in the front and a separate entrance, two exits really for your place. Mm-hmm. Now, the definitive way to know this is to get an architect, okay? Or if you want to avoid the cost of an architect, basically like write down some of those specifications, go sit down at City Hall, and the person there's someone there who will show you the diagram that says, okay, this is our zoning regulations. Do you think that your unit meets those zoning regulations? And then if it does, then you can, hire an architect to draw up a plan, because the city, in order to make that unit legal, has to emit a permit for it. And everything revolves around that permit. It's going to change your tax bill. And then instead of having, like in your case, a duplex, you would have a triplex. Okay. So this is the path towards legality. And like ultimately, if you're, trying to purchase a rental property that has a suite like this that's not legal, you need to do that due diligence to know exactly what you're purchasing. If, as is your case, you kind of already took over ownership of that because it was like a family property, you could do some due diligence with the city to see what is the long-term potential of transforming that. Like, is it with, whatever, 20K of investment, 15K of investment, can you have that suite be made legal? Okay. So that's always the first option because you're adding a basement suite like that is going to make your property value go up. The bank is going to lend you more money. You're going to be able to legally have more rent. Have you really been listening to the episode, or has your monkey mind been taking you off in one direction or another? Our mental habits can be our biggest assets or our biggest liabilities as we pursue certain goals. For me, the biggest performance gains have always come from training my mind. In my book, Mindful Landlord, I talk about how you can train your mind and how you can apply some of these strategies to your journey in the real estate field. The book is available on Amazon and also on its website, mindfullandlord.com. Now I'll stop evangelizing for the power of mental training and let you get back to the show. I think if we go back to the temptation part of the question, what happens if you have a suite like this and it's just kind of empty real estate? And I actually just worked on a transaction like this with some other investors who were starting out, who purchased a building that was listed as a 5-plex. So the listing on MLS was as a 5-plex, but when we got there, all of those red flags popped up. So I noticed that there was one electrical panel for the two, the main floor and the basement unit. I noticed there was one hot water tank. I noticed that there were those like really small windows that are too close to the ground for the city to ever have emitted a permit that would be an independent suite. And then lo and behold, we start digging and we discover that on the tax bill, it's listed as a 4-plex. Mm-hmm. So this means clearly that building its destination is to be used as a 4-plex. But now there's 2 separate kitchens. There were actually 2 leases in force when my clients purchased the building because the old owners didn't do the due diligence properly, probably didn't understand what they were buying. And so that's a problem. It's a problem from the point of view of the insurance, because you're basically illegally renting something with a rental contract. And should anything go wrong, a fire, even worse, something that has to do with the fact that like there's not the appropriate amount of entrances and exits, or that there's only one electrical panel and the tenant doesn't have access to it. Like those tenants are entitled to units that are to code and that are allowed to be there. And basically like you're engaged in kind of an illegal practice by renting that. Now, you could, if you inherit a building like that, you can say, well, the old owner was already exploiting it this way, or I didn't know. But if you have to do an insurance claim and then, either there's some kind of damages or the tenants are expecting to be relodged while they fix whatever it is, the insurance is not going to pay out as they should. So like in terms of your risk, like the main risk with this kind of situation, I would put the top risk as the insurance, because if ever something goes wrong, the tenants can come back against you for renting something illegal. The insurance might not pay out. Right. And then after that, of course, you have the bank, because you probably have a loan on the property and the bank will finance according to what's on your tax bill. So if the building is zoned as a 4-plex, but it's rented as a 5-plex, first of all, you can't really have 5 leases. They will only take 4 revenues into account. And should the bank discover that you're doing something illegal, they can call the mortgage. Okay. So they can require you to pay back the mortgage, and then you're going to get like a little check mark next to your name at the bank and have trouble potentially financing it again. Have I ever seen this happen? I have not. Okay. I have seen cases of insurance companies not paying out because people are renting in a way that they're not supposed to rent. That I have seen. As far as the bank putting their nose into something, really, to me, that is something that would happen after you have an insurance claim, because the insurance, in the worst case, has to speak to the bank. And if they then transmit the message to the bank that you're doing some kind of illegal rental, that's a problem. Then there's also a problem at the time of resale, because if you have a lease that's not supposed to be there, or you're advertising a 5-plex when it's actually a 4-plex, what happened in that transaction is my clients got a huge discount, because basically the seller was advertising something with 5 incomes that only had 4 incomes. So now the question is, you've taken over this unit, like there are basically like physically 2 suites there, but you're only legally allowed to rent 1 suite. What can you, as the owner of that, do? And so the answer is that there's kind of like a bit of a way around this, but it involves the tenants signing basically a master lease. Okay. Which means that you could rent to a group of people. So for example, you rent to a ground floor tenant, and then you put them into like a group on a common lease with the person who's going to occupy the basement. Now, this means that legally, those two people are bound in the same space. So they have to have probably one hydro account, one electricity account, one insurance account with both of their names on it. So you can see where the problem starts here, because now all of a sudden you basically have like two tenants who are being treated as one group of people. So if you have some kind of informal setup where, there's a family member who wants to like move a friend in, or like have something like that, that might be a situation in which you could set something up. Or if those tenants know each other in some way, they might be willing to like go in together on a place like that for some kind of discount, right? Like that's a potential avenue. But in order for it to be legal, you need to have a master lease with all the names on the master lease. And then probably realistically, you're going to end up having to assume some costs of maybe paying for the heating for both people, or doing something that treats them as if, they are on one lease. Legally, they're one entity.
Yeah.
And then the other problem becomes also in terms of the severability of the rent. So when you have more than one person on a lease, there's this severability clause. Okay. So you can either, if you have, let's say, 3 tenants, you can either stipulate each one owes, let's say the rent is $1,500, each one owes $500, $500, $500. If you make them severable, it means that each is only responsible for their $500. So let's say the basement person stops paying, but the ground floor person is still paying. You can only go after the basement person for the amount they owe you. You cannot go after both tenants for the full amount.
Interesting.
Yeah. But so this is a way you can sort of sell that to prospective people to go onto a master lease and say, okay, well, I can structure it into the lease contract that each one is responsible for their own rent amount. But realistically, because they can only have one insurance policy, and because they're going to have to share certain responsibilities, plus if something goes wrong, you might have to evict one and not the other. Then they both have to go to court. They're going to both have, the court order will be naming them both, right? Like one will say, okay, we exclude this person who's paid their rent, but they will still be named in any court order. So like as a tenant entering into this kind of a situation, it's not the best option for you, because you're sort of like tied, you're in bed with someone legally.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of,
and it sounds it sounds a little bit convoluted, like a little bit messy as well, because somebody doesn't want to be tied to another person who probably did not pay the rent. So things can get a little dicey on that end.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think like that's the, in terms of what do you do as a landlord to protect yourself, but to maybe also bring in some extra revenue? Well, the answer is like, this is the legal way forward, but it has some fairly large drawbacks for the tenants. And so either in practice, what I've seen is either it's people who know each other. So, friends or extended family or something like that, who wants to, rent out an additional place. They already have some sort of relationship that makes them more comfortable getting into this, or else you're offering a large discount to someone, and then make sure that they really understand properly what they're getting into, because since it is convoluted and a little bit unusual, like it's a way to make that situation legal, but it's not ideal for the tenants.
And who would be signing? Okay, you said friends and family members. Would this work for someone who's elderly and retired? Would this situation work for them?
Well, I think it's really, this is a very much a case by case sort of a thing. Like where I have seen this, and to be totally transparent, this is actually how I started my career. So I used to have students who wanted to live with multiple people in a unit. So it would be 3-bedroom units. The students wanted to have this kind of community aspect. And the first properties that I purchased and that I managed had these like larger units. Okay. So like 3-4 bedroom units. And then the students would want to rent by the room. But because you're not allowed to divide up a unit like that and rent by the room, the solution is you make a master lease for all 4 rooms, and then all of the occupants are on that master lease. Okay. And this tends to work well with students because they, like to share their living space. They're younger, they maybe have a lower budget, and they don't want to take the responsibility of like renting a 4-bedroom unit on their own and then portioning out the rents, right? So like if you as the landlord are able to make a master lease like that and then be like, okay, well, we're going to make you all severable, so all 4 of you just owes a portion of the rent. Here's how it works with the insurance. Your 4 names have to be on the contract. Here how it works with the hydro account. 4 names need to be on the contract. Like basically you are packaging them together and saying like you guys now become roommates. So I mean, with retirees, like from what I know, also some of the informal, like sort of not exactly a care home, but like places where like multiple seniors will share like one residence, you could run that on a similar system. Now I don't have personal experience with like running that to know what are the specific drawbacks, but like I could see that, being a model that works as somebody maybe needs less space, especially if you have a basement unit and it becomes like more difficult for the person to go up and down the stairs. And so they're like using the basement unit less. Like you're basically talking about the person taking on a roommate. So you're asking me like, who does it work for to have a roommate? There's lots of people that works for, but it tends to work for people who are comfortable with having joint responsibilities at the very least when it comes to insurance and like rent payment and stuff like that. Because even if there's independent kitchens and there's no sharing of common space, realistically, there's still legal responsibility that's shared for the rental of that area.
Good to know.
Okay.
No, you're talking and the wheels are turning in my head. So that's why I'm kind of quiet, because I'm really listening and taking notes.
Did you have any other sort of questions that surrounding that issue?
I guess more on the money aspect, but I think pretty much you have already answered the questions.
So the money aspect, can you be more specific?
Okay, so for example, is it best to take, because if the home has equity in it, right? Is it best to take the equity out at the time of renewing the mortgage, or when is the best time?
Okay, so let's bookend this within a discussion of like basement renovations, because that's kind of what we're talking about, and then we can sort of generalize it out from there. So I think one of the off-camera questions that you had for me was to do with, okay, what happens if, let's say, a landlord doesn't have the money to renovate that basement suite or to like get it up to code? And this is actually it's actually a common problem. Like this is specifically that, transaction that I just worked on for the illegal 5-plex. Like this was exactly what happened. So, my clients were expecting to buy a building with 5 units, and then they get there and they discover, wait a second, there's actually only 4 units. And we have this like large ground floor basement thing with 2 kitchens that was rented separately. Now we're going to take this over, and like we're going to end up having like fairly large renovations to do, either to put it back the way it was, because that's the other option, right? Is that like you can turn that unit back into one large unit and rent it as one large unit, right? Like and then the tenants either have to leave or not leave because you are bringing things back to code. So how do you finance that? If it's at the time of purchase, obviously you can negotiate money off the sale, or you could also apply for a construction loan. And that you can actually do at any time. So you don't have to necessarily be at the point of refinancing. If you have a certain amount of work that you want to do, for example, you want to like add a basement unit, or you want to take apart a basement unit that's been like illegally created or something. If you go to the bank and you come with your architect's plans and your estimates, the bank will give you a construction loan that gets added to your mortgage, that is then dispersed according to the different moments at which the work is completed. So independently of whether you want to be taking equity out of your home to do another investment, well, like another investment could be buying a new property, or it could be investing money in your current property to help you make more money. And so for someone in your situation who, from what I know about your basement suite, it seems to me that it might meet all the criteria to actually be a basement suite. So in which case I would do my due diligence at the city, find out, can I get the zoning changed? What's it going to cost for me to bring that up to code? And then if I don't have the money to do that, then I'm going to go to the bank with my permit from the city and my estimate and be like, look, guys, I want to go from a duplex to a triplex. Here's my plan. And they're going to have to change your mortgage anyways at that time, because anytime you make major changes to the property, you have to inform the bank. That's going to be a clause in your mortgage. And definitely moving from 2 units to 3 is exactly the kind of change that the bank needs to know about, because they're going to then change the financing criteria.
Good to know.
Yeah. Okay, so unless you have any other questions relating specifically to subletting and illegal units, I think we're going to just stop there, because we're kind of towards the end of time, and I think we've done a fairly good overview of it. Did you have any other questions on this topic?
Nope, that was pretty much it.
All right. Well, Chauntelle, thank you. This was a product of like an off-camera discussion that we had actually a couple of months ago, and Chauntelle was kind enough to come on the show and share her questions with everybody, so that all of you guys can, profit from the conversation. And I think that this is maybe not a conversation that concerns all investors, but for those who encounter these kind of situations where there are sketchy basement units or things that have been rented in a weird way, or facing temptation to sign leases that maybe you shouldn't sign, I think this is definitely some good information. So I want to just, thank you for coming in and sharing the time in the conversation with me.
Thank you, Terrie.
Thanks, Chauntelle.